Behold, the infamous Goblin Slayer, a legend among legends, a ladies' man to his core and a warrior of honor. Aside from his unusual riz and strict attitude, Goblin Slayer has to be the hardest working man I've ever seen. Even though countless women jump at the opportunity to lay in bed with him, he has one goal and one goal only: goblin slaying. Meet Anna, an ambitious priestess who was gifted divine blessings from the divine and wanted to be an adventurer to help people. How naive of her. The clerk tried explaining the ranks to her and how long it would take to climb up the ladder. She was given the lowest rank and was told to take it easy. She pointed towards the board for missions, and once her registration was complete, a random team asked her to join since they wanted a healer. She was tempted to help, and despite being warned, they paid no heed like a bunch of reckless newbies. They informed her how they accepted goblin slaying missions, but the clerk advised against this, since goblins were no joke. These cocky bunch paid no heed to her remarks and were feeling pumped. Upon entering the cave, the priestess was worried, and the team kept on downplaying the goblins' level, calling them mere fodder, even comparing them to little children and making a fool of themselves. One of their members was a witch who graduated from the capital, and as they headed deeper into the dungeon, the priestess asked if they brought some potions with them. However, they were broke adjacent and went in blindly. Soon enough, they heard a voice and got separated. While the priestess was falling back, she heard more noise from behind, and there they were, vicious goblins. They attacked all at once and caught them by surprise. The team tried their best to aid one another, and the priestess tried healing one of them, however. The goblins were too much for them. The party was terrified, and despite trying their best, they were no match and the priestess had to run away. Thankfully, a heroic knight clad in armor came to rescue the day. The infamous Goblin Slayer eviscerated all the heathens and saved the damsel in distress. Upon seeing his silver tag, she felt a sigh of relief, and he gave her a potion to heal herself on the spot. That sure was a close encounter. She insisted on tagging along since he saved her life, and they went ahead to seek vengeance. The Goblin Slayer explained how goblins were actually smart and learned to ambush people from countless experience. This guy sure knew what he was doing. The priestess lit a holy light, and this allowed the Goblin Slayer to get rid of the shaman and head back. She kept on blinding them with her blessing and giving the Slayer an advantage in battle. He lit them ablaze and headed deeper to the dungeon where they found a secret door. The Goblin Slayer did what he had to do and walked out of there like a bona fide warrior. The next day, the priestess went back to the guild and asked the Slayer to team up. In a flashback, we saw a young Musume, also known as Cowgirl and Goblin Slayer, arguing over her departure. She headed to the city alone, and they both felt depressed about it since they were good friends. In the present, Cowgirl is all grown up and could be my next waifu. Goblin Slayer is outside checking for goblin tracks while Cowgirl stares at him in fascination. Are these two a couple? I sure hope not, since I'd have to eliminate Goblin Slayer for her love. He seems to be paying rent to stay with them, and after eating their breakfast, the two went to the city to run errands. Their conversation seems a bit serious since Goblin Slayer wasn't willing to entertain her. Meanwhile, the guild encountered a poor fellow who was struggling with monsters. Soon enough, the place was packed with adventurers and boastful warriors. As soon as Goblin Slayer walked in, everyone started scorning him since he only took goblin missions. Everyone took missions that pleased them, and the place got hectic out of nowhere. Suddenly, the priestess came by trying to persuade our Slayer to take other missions, but he just ended up lecturing her with Cowgirl waiting for him awkwardly. Afterward, they took another goblin mission and took directions from the clerk. Slayer left Cowgirl at the guild, looking shocked, and she proceeded to wait for him all night. However, our boy was too busy grinding in the dungeon. In a flashback, we see how Slayer's sister was ravaged by goblins and is the reason he is so adamant about obliterating them from the face of the earth. He continued burning their fortress and showed no mercy to these beasts. As soon as they attacked, the priestess used her holy magic to block their escape and let them incinerate. This whole instance was tough on the little girl, even though it was an average day for our hero. The following day, he went back home to his lovely maiden. Meanwhile, thunder was blaring like crazy, and the weather seemed like something outside of biblical tales. Something surely wicked this way comes. Back at the guild, everyone was looking at the elf and her party who were looking for the Goblin Slayer. The elf and the dwarf did not seem to get along, but thankfully, the lizard man tried explaining the situation to the clerk. Soon after, the devil himself walked in like nothing happened and met the sorry bunch. They wanted to discuss an urgent matter with him, and they all headed upstairs. The priestess fell back and felt a bit depressed. Some adventurers came along trying to recruit her, but she defended him and met another seductive adventurer. The witch, also known as Maja, tried explaining her relationship with the Goblin Slayer and how she helped him with a scroll long time ago. Is that all she helped him with? The witch seems deviously cunning, and after warning the priestess, she walked away while the elf tried recruiting the Goblin Slayer to her crew. After criticizing him and arguing with the dwarf, they debriefed him of the Demon King and realized he was not interested in anything but goblins. Afterward, the lizard convinced him to eliminate the goblins who were causing chaos. They explained what they knew of the nest and asked him for assistance, since the military refused to destroy them. He then collected his coins and wanted to head out. The priestess asked to join and pleaded him, since they were a duo. This guy sure is tough. The rest followed right after, and they ended up making a bonfire while forming a strategy to eliminate the goblins. The elf ended up sharing some food, and the dwarf followed up by offering some wine. They were all impressed, and the elf got a tad bit too drunk. Afterward, the slayer shared some cheese, and this caught the lizard off guard. They continued discussing about their abilities and background. Before they realized, these unruly bunch were actually bonding. Soon enough, they started discussing about goblins and their arrival. Some theorized that the goblins came from the green moon above them, and the slayer confessed about his older sister. The rest got tired and decided to rest for the night. Cowgirl was still waiting for her hopeless lover, and the next day, they officially raided the goblin dungeon. The goblin slayer soaked some blood to smear it all over his comrades, in hopes of camouflaging their scents. Afterwards, they went into the dungeon looking at the artistry on the wall, while the elf complained about the blood. They came to a sudden halt when they noticed weird signs on the ground. They hypothesized that it could be a trap. The dwarf agreed, and the goblin slayer led the way deep inside. As they went in, the stench grew pungent, and they found a poor soul locked. Just then, a goblin attacked out of nowhere and was struck down. Afterward, the lizard conjured a summoning and helped the prisoner escape. After taking out a map, the goblin slayer was ready to move forward and slay a bunch of vicious miscreants. The elf kept on knocking them down with her arrow, and they huddled together to strategize a plan. Meanwhile, the goblin slayer was acting tough and bossing them around. The elf became emotional after seeing one of her kind being tortured, and the team seemed to have found common ground. After moving a bit, they found a bunch of goblins sleeping and laid an ambush. The dwarf released some wine through the air to intoxicate them, and the priestess fortified it with a silence spell. Afterward, the team went to work doing what they do best. The elf was studying the goblin slayer's movement, and soon after, they had completed their mission with ease. However, things weren't going to be that simple, since they encountered a gigantic ogre. Not only was this guy gigantic, but he was among the demon lord's generals. This should be terrifying. He was able to wield elemental magic and threw a fireball at them, which the priestess defended. Things went from bad to worse real quick for our sorry bunch. The lizard summoned more warriors using an ancient spell, and the dwarf kept on throwing rocks at the ogre. This severely damaged him while the slayer tried attacking and was swatted away. It seems the ogre was capable of regeneration, and the priestess headed towards the slayer in hopes of healing him. The team was struggling to keep up, and things seemed dire. The priestess gave some healing potions to our slayer, who was ready to wreak havoc. He walked with some courage and pride, however. The ogre seemed unbeatable. Even so, the slayer unleashed an unearthly power on him, completely obliterating the ogre. He used a scroll which unlocked a swift sea attack. Afterwards, the goblin laid the big guy to rest and went back home confidently. What an unexpected turn of events. The next day, Goblin Slayer was conducting his usual goblin inspection while Cowgirl tried flirting with him. Even though it was subtle, it still was obvious to the naked eye. Meanwhile, another set of adventurers were struggling with sewer rodents, and we saw firsthand how powerful magic was. Even so, they ended up running away and received no rewards for their cowardice. The man kept on complaining about the sword he left behind, and they both were dead broke. Elsewhere, Goblin Slayer was visited by his team, who wanted to ask if he had more cheese in his inventory. It seems the lizard fell in love with it, and the elf wanted to ask him out on another adventure. Back at the guild, The poor kid was begging the advanced adventurers for a spare sword, and the magician gave him a candle to locate his hidden sword. It grew hotter as he approached the lost item. Afterward, the Goblin Slayer went to the blacksmith looking for repairs and ran into the hopeless priestess who ranked up. Obsidian rank, would you look at that? She was extremely grateful about her promotion, while the adventurers were still begging for another sword. They had no chance and went to the guild clerk to ask for help. However, she suggested asking Goblin Slayer for advice since he was knowledgeable. He gave them some good advice and told them to use clubs to retrieve their swords. Afterward, the clerk asked the Slayer for some assistance in observing a promotion exam. Elsewhere, the adventurers used the candle to locate their missing sword and killed a rodent using the club. Meanwhile, the clerk was interrogating a cocky adventurer who stole money from his team. A truth detector was present who confirmed his deception, and the clerk started cracking down on him. She demoted him and exiled him from the guild. The guy started going crazy and tried attacking, but was immediately stopped. Elsewhere, the adventurers were attacked by nasty bugs and found themselves cornered. As a result, they threw the candle and electrocuted the bugs, giving them a chance. After all was said and done, they managed to successfully defeat them. The clerk, on the other hand, was truly grateful to the Slayer who left in a hurry, while the truth detector lady kept on teasing the clerk for her crush on the Slayer. I guess there's no escaping this spell. Meanwhile, 3 adventurers raided Alicia's castle to destroy his evil plans. Wait a minute, is he a lich or an undead? It doesn't matter since they annihilated him in one shot. Elsewhere, rumors were spreading around in the guild about the hero's successful conquest. Goblin Slayer, on the other hand, was focused on one thing and one thing only: goblin slaying. Nothing else mattered in his agenda, and he wasn't even listening to the priestess or elf. Even though they were a group, there was no democracy, and it all entailed on goblin slaying. Left with no option, they all agreed under the condition that they won't use fire, poison, or water to kill them. Then what is he supposed to use? Cuddles and snuggles? They then arrived to a nearby town who summoned them, and the place looked luxuriously beautiful. They were all amazed by the scenery while Goblin Slayer headed straight towards his client, also known as the Sword Maiden, an archbishop who helped defeat the Demon Lord years ago. Upon first glance, you can tell she was divinely gorgeous. Why did she have a blindfold, though? Was she trying to imitate Gojo? She then started narrating her story of how goblins had been attacking their town frequently. Goblins were assaulting everyone, and the group estimated that the goblins were using the lower ruins to unleash surprise attacks. The archbishop asked a lot of people to help, but they all refused, until of course, Goblin Slayer came to the rescue. She begged him to help her and save the town, but Goblin Slayer was acting indifferent to her suffering. Afterward, they decided to head to the sewers. When the archbishop revealed how the military force won't help them, as such, they were on their own. She continued to unveil a map of the town and the sewers. Without further ado, Goblin Slayer was anxious to slay some demonic mongrels. Soon after, they headed down and started beating up some weak-foot soldiers. But this was only the beginning, according to Goblin Slayer. They weren't even close to the source. As they continued to march forward, the elf sensed something strange and started to hear water. The dwarf estimated it could be leakage, but then they were all ambushed by goblins riding on a boat. The priestess used her magic to shield them from the arrows. But more importantly, since when did goblins possess intelligence? The crew was stuck, thinking what to do next, and Goblin Slayer prepared what seemed like a mini grenade. As soon as the barrier was down, he threw the jar which contained toxins. This allowed them to attack head-on and knock them off the boat. Wait a minute, can't goblins swim? Either way, it seems like the crew were doing pretty decent, and the dwarf cemented their victory with impressive earthbending skills. They then encountered a gigantic crocodile, but they called it a swamp dragon. This creature was extremely terrifying, to be honest. Goblin Slayer carried the priestess while they made a run for it, and then a bunch of goblins on boats were ambushed by the swamp dragon after being led by the priestess. Now this is how you outsmart your opponents, to be honest, Goblin Slayer informed them, how someone showed the goblins how to use boats, indicating a traitor amidst their ranks. I wonder who it could have been. This must have been the result of something diabolical. The following day, the priestess was enjoying her bath, and it seems the party declined her offer due to their personal reasons. As expected, Goblin Slayer walked off and left them in the dark. The poor girl started feeling anxious, and that's when the Sword Maiden showed up looking fabulous as usual. She had the most amazing melons the priestess has ever seen. our beautiful queen proceeded to explain the history behind her war scars and complimented the priestess for her due diligence and hard work. As she twirled her hair and stood up, we were taken aback by her unfound beauty. Soon after, she warned her of Goblin Slayer and how he prefers isolation over companionship. One day, he is bound to leave, and these words took the priestess by storm. Later that night, the elf was walking in town and kept on receiving fishy looks. Fortunately, she met up with Goblin Slayer, who was lost in thought and tried looking for another goblin mission on the news board. No matter how hard he tried to look, there was nothing remotely related to goblins anywhere. He was about to give up until he purchased a canary and headed towards the sewers with his gang. The group felt confused why he brought the bird along, and our friendly warrior explained how canaries scream when they smell poison gas. Oh wow, what a genius move. This guy must be a genius tactician. Imagine if he led an army. They were all super impressed with his knowledge, and the priestess kept on recalling the maiden's word. They opened a door and noticed how the torch was missing, indicating the presence of someone else or something else. The dwarf surmised that they could be warriors or adventurers seeking to search for treasure. However, it could also be a mass grave meant to protect their legacies. They were unsure, and Goblin Slayer wasn't willing to stand there and find out. The man stood on business and pushed them to fulfill their roles, which was slaying goblins at any cost. They ran into another door, and Goblin Slayer bashed it open. He held the priestess back and told her it was a trap. The door closed behind them, and before they knew it, the goblins unleashed the poison gas into the room, leaving them dead to rights. The dwarf tried thinking of a plan while the priestess was panicking. Luckily, the Goblin Slayer gave them some material to use as a mask. He gave the dwarf some equipments to block the poisonous gas from entering, and the shorty did not disappoint. The lizard stood still, feeling dazed, and they ended up barricading the door to slow them down. The goblins tried breaking down the door as our heroic warriors armed themselves for combat. The lizard used his spell to summon elite warriors, whilst the priestess used her defensive magic to barricade them inside. But things weren't over just yet, and the goblins made it through in droves. Before they realized it, there was a goblin champion amidst them. The younglings rushed at them with fervor, and the Goblin Slayer didn't waste any time eliminating them with his bare hands. What a cinematic performance. There were too many of them, and the priestess was started to feel weakened. The champion was on another level and knocked the Goblin Slayer down, fatally injuring him. The priestess panicked, and the goblins broke the barrier. Oh man, this was about to go horribly wrong. The champion wasted no time, and Goblin Slayer felt desperate and weak. However, his life started flashing before his eyes, and his demon mode was unlocked. He got up and held the champion in a rear naked choke, strangling him with some leftover hair he found on the ground. Now that's what you call resourceful. The champion tried fighting for dear life, and the dwarf saved the elf. Would you look at that? The Goblin Slayer actually did it. He managed to defeat a champion all on his own. What a terrifying aura from this man. The rest of the goblins ran away in fear of the legend, and the elf came to his aid. The dwarf helped, and the lizard told them she was all right. Priestess tried apologizing for her weakness and started shedding tears. Before they knew it, the Goblin Slayer fell to the ground and rattled them to the core. Wait a minute, is this the end for our brave hero? No, it can't be. In a flashback, the young Goblin Slayer was sitting in a cave, begging for his master's help. All the while, he was being reprimanded by this deep, wretched voice echoing all around him. He felt miserable and stood there enduring the pain. All of a sudden, his master showed up, and it was actually a goblin. What a major plot twist. To think the Goblin Slayer's master was actually a goblin, the sense of irony is surreal. He gave him a riddle and told him to answer before the spikes fall down. What? Isn't this a bit harsh for the kid? I mean, give this man a break. What a hideous-looking goblin, though. Back in the present, the Goblin Slayer woke up without his armor, and our boy was shredded. Also, is that the priestess sleeping besides him? The busty Iron Maiden made her way into his chambers to congratulate him on his victory. She sat beside him and asked how he was feeling. My guy must be thrilled since he slept with 2 hotties, but I bet he doesn't remember any of it. The priestess was so worried, and that's when the Iron Maiden confessed her past run-in with the goblins. Her scars were from those pesky monsters, and her traumatic past still haunts her to this day. Not only was she traumatized, but her vision was taken away from her, and she tried tempting the Goblin Slayer using her seductive touch. Even so, this man was made of steel and gave 0 f***s. Was it getting cold in there because her melons were popping? Soon after, the priestess woke up feeling ashamed and asked him how he was feeling. He put on his armor and told her everything was okay. The gang barged in without knocking and made themselves home. The Goblin Slayer was more worried about the canary, though, who was fortunately okay. The elf continued to tease the poor priestess, who was blushing like a tomato. The lizard insisted they recover first, but the dwarf interjected and suggested eating first. The Goblin Slayer was taken aback after hearing they still hadn't eaten anything. Now that's loyalty for you. Afterward, they went to a fine Italian restaurant and started munching like crazy. Once they were done, the priestess and the slayer were told to take a break while they scoured the sewers. The young lady was feeling anxious walking alongside him, since he seemed indifferent towards everything. She tried confronting him about it, but the guy was too busy thinking of what to do next. He told her to replace her armor, and she went to have it repaired, since it was special to her. The Goblin Slayer also handed in his entire equipment for some maintenance. Since he was a silver rank, they took him seriously, especially after he paid in advance. He chose a sword he liked and continued to patch it up for his mission. The priestess was proud, and later on, the two went on a walk and encountered an ice cream stand. They both didn't know what it was, and he told her to buy some for the sake of experimentation. This guy has zero riz, to be honest with you. I doubt he'd ever get laid with this attitude. The priestess really enjoyed it, and the slayer wanted to know all about it, since he considered it was a spell at first. The seller tried explaining the science behind it, and he bought one for himself. As they sat on a bench, staring at the stunning sunset, the priestess started talking about the recent goblin attacks. That's when he started opening up and talking about his past, how he was afraid all the time, and how his fear held him back from multiple opportunities. But now, he had someone he could rely on, and this gave the priestess goosebumps. Was she smitten with him? It would seem that way. Soon after, a couple of adventurers headed their way after he summoned them with a letter. The witch was looking impeccable as always. Those melons were quite delicious to look at. After delivering the package he asked for, they started giving him an attitude. Later that night, the cowgirl was growing worried since the Goblin Slayer hasn't been back in a while. Despite his disappearance, she had hope and refused to let him go. Elsewhere, the Slayer and his gang went back to the sewers, and it seemed he was holding a sack of rice or something. The lizard led them towards a strange-looking monster. The one-eyed Antichrist is what they should have labeled it. They couldn't get past it since its lasers were quite deadly. The lizard explained its ability as disintegrate, that which destroys everything it touches. The Goblin Slayer was trying to think of a plan, and the priestess asked if she should put up a barrier. The elf kept on mouthing off about ethical attacks, but in times of crisis, the means always justify the ends, in my opinion. Without wasting any more time, she went into the room and tried distracting the eyeball, while the dwarf spit some alcohol to blur its vision and dampen its consciousness. That's when the Slayer released the flower, creating a smoke screen. The lizard took the opportunity to summon a warrior, and the priestess was ready to cast a spell. She used her protection barrier, and upon unleashing the disintegration laser, the monster ended up destroying itself. Now that's what you call amazing. The Goblin Slayer has the IQ of a genius. Had he not chosen this barbaric career, he could have made it as a teacher or a scholar. The gang admired his effort and thanked him for bringing the pesky monster down. Afterward, the lizard showed them a mirror and asked the priestess to investigate. Upon touching it, the Goblin Slayer realized it was a portal, and they were able to see the goblin colony from afar. The elf couldn't believe her eyes, since the goblins were using advanced technology and were able to teleport seamlessly. Oh no, this sounds like a lot of trouble. Someone powerful must be aiding them in their conquest. Otherwise, there's no way they figured this out on their own. Goblins are not built like that. The Goblin Slayer tried thinking of a plan on the spot, and soon after, an army of goblins came running to protect their precious portal. They were stuck, and after looking around, they decided to barricade the door and build a fortress around them. They finished their preparations, and the priestess was ready to cast her spell as well. The lizard volunteered to summon a warrior and proceeded to cast a spell. The dwarf was told to stay on the lookout, while the elf picked a fight with him out of friendly spite. The goblins were nearing the door, and the Slayer told them to give it their all. As soon as they reached them, the elf took her position and shot the first arrow. The Slayer used a slingshot, and they slowly started culling their numbers. There were still many of them standing, and it seems like they were using arrows as well. Fortunately, the lizard skeleton saved them in the nick of time, while the lizard was trying to break the portal. He empowered his muscles and went to work while a hobgoblin showed up out of nowhere. The elf was growing worried, and the slayer helped gather more arrows for her. The dwarf was holding his own, and the priestess decided to help the lizard. The big guy was looking quite fierce, but our unruly bunch weren't willing to give up without a fight. All of a sudden, the lizard did it and brought down the portal. The slayer baited him to approach, and using the priestess's holy light, they managed to blind them, and the dwarf unleashed hell upon them via his spells. Color me impressed. They actually managed to defeat an entire army and came out unscathed. The elf started criticizing their risky plan while the lizard was feeling grateful for everything. However, the portal wasn't shattered, but does it still work? Elsewhere, the maiden was approached by the slayer who had great news for her. However, he confronted her about knowing the goblins were inside the sewers and asked her why she kept silent about it. He also asked if the alligator swamp was her doing, to which she agreed. All of this seems to bother the goblin slayer, who couldn't wrap his head around it. If she had known of the atrocities the goblins were committing, how could she remain silent? It was a travesty to even think about. But the maiden had her own agenda, which was nothing like he imagined. Due to her past trauma, she was still terrified of these heathens and wanted nothing to do with them. That's why she wanted them to stay in the sewers. Also, since she was considered a hero, no one would believe her if she claimed goblins were a threat. As such, she was stuck in between a rock and a hard place. Fortunately for her, the heaven-sent guardian came to thwart the goblins' onslaught and rescue the desperate damsel in distress. She gave her sincere gratitude and couldn't explain the happiness she was feeling now that the goblins were gone. Our knight in shining armor really did pull a number on her. Ha! These two should get married. They'd make a perfect couple. He even made her weak in the knees. Now that's next level Riz. Now that their mission was done, they were heading back to their hometown feeling satisfied and fulfilled. They saved the town, got paid heavily, and evolved as warriors. The Goblin Slayer suggested making ice cream when they returned and started explaining the details of making it. The dwarf insisted to help, and everyone chimed in to taste this delicious nectar of the heavens. We were then flashed to a brutal war zone. A fierce battle was underway between the forces of darkness and good. The heroes were fighting against the infamous Demon King. Meanwhile, the gang were still traveling back home, while Goblin Slayer started reminiscing of his first crush. Of a time she confessed her admiration, and he shut her down like a sore loser. What was his problem? Oh yeah, she went to the city and left him. His sister told him not to let his anger and envy take over. Otherwise, he'll also end up as a goblin. She insisted he apologize, and later that night, she made him his favorite dinner. This memory was very fond to him, and now he could barely remember any of it. He got out to inspect the fields and make sure there were no goblin attacks. Out of nowhere, the heavenly bestowed cowgirl graced us with her royal presence. Now this girl is a keeper. Don't fumble the bag, my friend. Her uncle was thrilled, since the heroes defeated the demon lord, and the cowgirl served them breakfast like the perfect waifu she was. Since she had some deliveries in town, Goblin Slayer volunteered to take her. As they were walking to town, he told her he had errands to run and went back to the guild where no one recognized him because of his armor. They treated him like he was a newbie and tried talking down to him. Even the witch didn't recognize him. However, after putting on his new armor, the old one was beyond repair. This was a man on a mission, I tell you. He stood there watching a couple of adventurers sparring, and one of them tried chatting him up about the goblin situation in town. She even tried inducting him into their gang, but we all know that's not going to happen. She stepped in and looking beautiful doing it. Meanwhile, the priestess ran into the Goblin Slayer and asked him what he was doing here. That's when the nosy clerk interrupted and tried shooting her shot with him. They both had a crush on him, and things felt really awkward. She then handed him a letter and told him there were no goblin missions lately. The priestess kept on thinking about the maiden when the gang showed up and invited them to lunch. The elf insisted he join, and that's when the cowgirl showed up. Oh wow, who would have thought they would all gather in one place? Goblin Slayer might as well form a harem at this point. The cowgirl, the elf, the priestess, and the clerk. He could even add the maiden to make it a 5-piece. The group decided to celebrate their victory and started recalling the details of the battle. The clerk then told them about the new training home they planned on opening, where veteran adventurers could train the newbies on the art of warfare and defending themselves from danger. Sounds like a great idea if you ask me. Consider it a win-win situation, the cowgirl agreed, since she wanted him to retire. Afterward, they started walking back home, and she confessed how she was worried about him. The following day, he opened the letter, and it was in fact from the maiden. The Slayer was on her mind, and her dreams were now goblin-free, thanks to his efforts. Peace was finally an achievable concept, and everything seemed to go smoothly. Later that night, the bar was pumped up to witness the drinking competition between the dwarf and the elf. They were all rooting for them, and even placed bets to see who would win. The witch had her money on the elf, while the rest chose the stubborn dwarf. Gambling on a drinking competition? What an absurd idea. The lizard told the priestess to watch and have fun, while the goblin slayer was staring into the moon alongside his beautiful crush. Can she even be considered as his girlfriend at this point? Well, she surely pulled him in like a dominatrix and tried to romanticize the moment. Unfortunately, his armor was getting in the way, and she was unable to access his body. She went to bed feeling depressed and wondered if she'd ever have a chance with him. The town was buzzing with celebrations after the Demon King's defeat, and it seems the dwarf won the drinking competition. What was the Goblin Slayer up to now? Hold up, were those footprints? The cowgirl was cooking breakfast when Goblin Slayer came bearing bad news. There was tracks, and it was those of goblins. Not just ordinary ones either, an entire battalion, to make matters worse. This was on open ground, and he wasn't used to fighting like this. Also, they weren't led by a hobgoblin or a champion. Rather, a goblin lord. The highest level a goblin can achieve in their lifetime. The attack was imminent, and the military would not intervene. Cowgirl was lost for words and couldn't fathom what was happening. Goblin Slayer was starting to lose hope and gave up on the idea of fighting them. As such, he insisted they ran away as far as they could. Despite his warning, the stubborn girl refused and told him to F off. She wasn't willing to let him go that easily, and he started telling her of the atrocities goblins are known for. Death is considered a mercy, and that's if they granted it. Even so, Cowgirl had balls of steel and started shedding tears. She didn't want to leave him for a second time and watch him forfeit his life for nothing. Seeing her resolve, Goblin Slayer promised to do whatever it takes. Before he left, her uncle told him to watch out and take care of himself, since she loved him with all her heart and didn't want to see him get hurt. The Goblin Slayer went to the guild and tried talking to the witch and her gang. Wait, was he addressing everyone in the guild? He started informing them of the imminent goblin attack and how there were more than 100 strong warriors amongst them. He went on to explain how powerful a goblin lord was and the danger it posed. He even bowed down and begged for their help. One cocky adventurer got up and asked for a fair compensation if he wanted to get the job done. The elf tried going after them, but was held back. Just then, the Goblin Slayer offered up everything he owned, including his assets and belongings. His words touched everyone involved, and his resolve motivated them to action. The cocky prick agreed to join in return for a drink, and the elf volunteered as well. The dwarf chimed in alongside the lizard. Wait, where was the priestess? She would have been ideal in this situation. The witch got up from her seat and courted the attention of the whole guild. That's when the guild offered a reward of 1 gold coin for every goblin killed. Now you're talking. The highest-ranked adventurers agreed to help as well, and seeing them join, even the newbies were inspired to help out. Slaying goblins was a dangerous job, but if everyone joined hands, they could achieve the impossible. There she was, the missing priestess. Later that night, the goblins were ready to attack, and their lord gave the signal to start the onslaught. These guys were truly barbaric in every sense of the word. What a scary bunch. Back at the farm, Cowgirl was growing worried, and soon after, a couple of them showed up looking menacing. These guys were fighting dirty, but the dwarf and witch had some tricks up their sleeves. The adventurers launched their attack, and the elf went on the offensive. As soon as they rescued the hostages, the swordsmen went into battle, laying waste to each and every living goblin. The lizard jumped in, and it seems the witch had placed a defensive barrier around them. Damn, their teamwork was on a whole other level. The newbies stayed behind to alert them of surprise attacks. They formed a wall and prepared to unleash the hidden spears on the goblin riders. What a genius strategy. I'm certain it was Goblin Slayer who came up with this battle tactic. One by one, the goblins were going down, and the humans saved one another. I told you the goblins planned everything out. He was the mastermind behind this entire strategy. It's like he was a scholar when it came to goblins. They even had a hobgoblin amongst them, and this guy was huge and powerful. His presence alone was terrifying, and wait, They even had goblin champions? Goddamn, the highest ranked adventurers volunteered to take them on head on, and this was promising to be a deadly battle. I love how nonchalant the witch is about all of this. Meanwhile, the Goblin Lord was running for dear life and ran to the infamous Goblin Slayer in the forest. Upon seeing him, the Lord started shaking like a belly dancer and lost all the courage he had. I won't lie, anyone would in the presence of this demon. The Goblin Slayer had successfully destroyed his nest, and this left the Goblin Lord no option but to fight back. Since he had nowhere to retreat to, he might as well take his revenge out on the Slayer who orchestrated this entire war. Even so, this was not going to be an easy job. Elsewhere, the newbie adventurers were giving it their all and realized just how difficult fighting goblins actually was. The elf and dwarf eliminated them on their end and awaited orders from the rest. The lizard finished things on his end as well, and only the goblin champions remained. Despite the size difference, the higher-ranked adventurers weren't letting up and gave it their all. This guy looks like Guts from Berserk, doesn't he? His partner looks stunning, though. The witch watched on as her comrade dealt the finishing blow in the most epic manner. What a scary duo. Meanwhile, the Goblin Slayer was finding it hard to pin down the Lord, and the cowgirl couldn't contain her anxiety. Fortunately, our boy did not know the meaning of giving up and tried to crawl his way back. Things started to look dire, and just as he was about to join the pearly gates, the Goblin Lord witnessed a terrifying aura emanating from the priestess. She managed to immobilize him using her barriers and almost squashed him to death. Wow, this girl is terrifying. The Lord started crying and tried begging for mercy, but she wasn't a fool, nor was the Goblin Slayer who slayed him on the spot. Yap, that's his name all right. Did they finally do it? It seems the Goblin Slayer had planned this out from the get-go, using himself as bait. The priestess used her divine healing to cure his injuries and apologized for her incompetence. She was really worried about him, huh? What a touching moment this was. Had it not been for the cowgirl, these two would have made the perfect couple. Everyone else started gathering the goblins for their reward, while the witch looked stunning as always. She is definitely my favorite character. They saluted the Slayer as he walked back home, and the cowgirl's heart skipped a beat upon seeing her savior. The following day, the heroes who defeated the Demon Lord arrived in town, hoping to join the festival, but realized the goblin infestation was getting much worse. One of them tried downplaying their strength, but another admonished her, saying goblins were the real deal. Had it not been for the Goblin Slayer, they would have never known safety. As such, the elf toasted his victory and celebrated with everyone on a job well done. These guys really managed to save the entire village and city. All hail the Goblin Slayer, I suppose. Had it not been for him, they would have had several causalities. The priestess took a nap while the cowgirl thanked her hero for his hard work. Afterward, he told her he wanted a change of pace and wanted to try other missions besides goblin slaying. Wouldn't that defeat the purpose of his name and title? What else would we call the Goblin Slayer if he wasn't killing those nasty heathens? The priestess got up and tried giving back the gold coin he gave her, but he insisted she was the one responsible for killing the Goblin Lord. As such, earned the prize, fair and square. The dynamic between these two is giving me goosebumps. Also, what happened to his left arm? Was it broken or something? Either way, the priestess tried to inspire him to work even harder for the sake of the people and asked for a reward. She wanted him to take off his helmet since she never saw him the last time. Oh, come on, show us his face already. What's with the suspense and multiple angles? Everyone was shocked and flocked towards him, since this was the first time they saw his true face. Come on, show us something. The witch had the hots for him, and the entire guild made a huge fuss out of it, but we were left in the dark. Well, that's not fair. What were the writers even thinking? When it comes to goblins, there's only one man capable of dealing with them. A man who is not swayed by money, women, lust, or fame. No matter the temptation or the alluring figures, Goblin Slayer ain't no simp and always stands on business. If someone asks you for the definition of an alpha male, Goblin Slayer should be your prime example. In the outskirts of the city, Goblin Slayer was roaming the peaceful farm, searching for signs of the Green Goblin's hideout. However, back in the Buzzing Guild, adventurers from all over the country were ready to make a name for themselves. The priestess and the elf were excited to start their second year of adventuring. Believe it or not, It's been that long since the famous cave incident involving you-know-what. Everyone had their eyes set on them, since their beauty was alluring and their presence radiated throughout the guild. The priestess didn't mind, since she was used to all the attention, while the elf was preoccupied dealing with the letter her friend gave her. While they were discussing matters, a couple of adventurers headed out for battle, and this worried the priestess a lot, since she couldn't shake the feeling that something bad was going to happen, like the cave incident that shan't be spoken of. The elf told her to take it easy while the dwarf jumped in and made fun of her ears. Soon after, the most seductive witch to have ever graced our screens passed by alongside some senior adventurers. They all greeted them cheerfully, and that's when the lizard walked in feeling optimistic about their next mission. Only one man was left, and we all know the story revolved him. Drum rolls, please. Cue Goblin Slayer. The man of the hour walked in like they owed him money and told them it was time to go goblin hunting. The team didn't object, even though the elf wanted to try something else. Goblin Slayer didn't pay them any heed and went ahead to discuss matters with a couple of other adventurers. He towered above the receptionist, who handed him a couple of goblin missions and told him rookies took a few jobs for their own. Oh no, that sounds like trouble. He then asked her for a couple of potions to get the ball rolling and started stocking up. His team came by to gear up as well and handed him 3 golden coins. A fellow adventurer came by feeling confused since they were marking the potions to distinguish them by feel. Well, that sounds exactly like a strategy Goblin Slayer would concoct. She ran off to her squad while the priestess took a look at the missions and criticized our boy for his lethargic nature. Everyone kept on spreading rumors about him, since he was a legend, and while they were walking outside, a rude adventurer bumped into them and acted all haughty and arrogant. Someone needs to teach this brat a lesson. The crocodile called him a rotten apple, and later that night, they returned debilitated and hungry. The elf could barely walk, and Goblin Slayer was about to slay an adventurer thinking he was a goblin. The receptionist apologized for her clumsiness and thanked him for his hard work. He dealt with several goblins in a single day, going from nest to nest. However, the cocky adventurer, also known as Boy Magician, wait a minute, are you saying he doesn't have a legit name, or were the writers lazy enough not to give him one? What's with giving everyone a title instead of a proper label? Either way, the magician boy asked for his help, but the Goblin Slayer refused and took his share of the reward. A hefty pouch for all those missions. Sounds fair enough. After hearing of the boy's unfortunate circumstances, he took him deep to the forest and into their farm. The beautiful cowgirl, greeted them with their enormous jugs and caught the rookie adventurer off guard. Her melons were as perky as the day I laid eyes on them. Unfortunately for them, her uncle refused to harbor some ruffian they just met, especially one who was broke and incapable of battle. Harsh words coming from a senile geezer. The Goblin Slayer offered to have him rest in the barn he was renting and gave him his bed. The silly kid still had a mean ego and looked down upon the Goblin Slayer after all he did for him. Kids nowadays. The following day, they went back to the guild where the Goblin Slayer told him to hunt rats or something. He then made his way back to the team and saw Priestess sobbing because they declined her rank promotion. She looks cute when she's upset. The lizard and dwarf tried consoling her, even though Goblin Slayer didn't care, since he didn't believe in ranks and instead focusing on empowering her abilities. The boy magician came through to insult the priestess. What was this guy's problem? Someone needs to humble him. He ended up becoming public enemy number 1 and even screamed at the Goblin Slayer. This rookie was about to receive the lesson of a lifetime. One of the adventurers suggested he go goblin hunting, and the team had no option but to include him into their ranks. The priestess led the way, and the Goblin Slayer insisted on gathering information first. Meanwhile, the dwarf was getting tipsy in the tent, while Goblin Slayer and the priestess talked with one of the elderly seniors about the recent goblin attacks. He informed them how a couple of people went missing alongside tools and equipment they kept on stealing. He was worried they received a taste and would keep on coming back. The priestess asked him if he knew where their hideout was or which direction they were coming from. These dwarves were livid and gave them a map. Goblin Slayer was familiar with the territory, considering it a mausoleum. The priestess ended up asking him a few more questions, taking charge and leading the operation so that she could rank up and receive a promotion. The dwarf wasn't of much help, and the lizard told them to head out and look for any traps. Elf Girl was feeling bored since she was all about that wildlife and didn't bother for the details or analysis. The newbie couldn't fathom all of this since he expected goblin slaying was an easy task. They soon made their way to the mausoleum entrance where the boy kept on yapping his mouth like a spoiled toddler. Could someone shut him up, please? The priestess commanded them all to get ready and headed into the abandoned heritage. As usual, the goblins were just minding their own business when the Slayer crept up on them. The elf didn't hold back, and the newbie was startled by all of this. He was finally getting a taste of his own medicine. Once all was said and done, he wanted to speed things up, like he was of any help. He just stood there while the rest dealt with the problem. This guy is seriously starting to get on my nerves at this point. The Slayer pointed out a trap by the door, and the dwarf suggested taking it down. While they were contemplating, the newbie rushed in for the kill and encountered a corpse. This was an alarm, and he ran deeper into the maze where he witnessed the dastardly nature of the goblins. He used his magic to blast them off and ran into a gigantic hobgoblin that nearly killed him with a single strike. The goblins began to surround him, and this was karma in full effect. I actually don't feel sorry for him. However, the Goblin Slayer had a mission and wasn't willing to take hostages. The elf came by to help alongside the rest of the crew. They distracted the rest long enough to find a way out. The priestess hesitated to form a plan, and the Slayer commanded her to light up a path for them to escape. In times of crisis, always put your faith in the Goblin Slayer. He unleashed hell upon the goblins and lit them ablaze. Afterwards, he caught up with the elf but ran into a dead end. The newbie saw firsthand what it took to battle goblins. The hobgoblin wasn't done with them just yet, and asked the dwarf if he could help out. The priestess used her light once more to blind it, while the elf summoned some water and Goblin Slayer managed to freeze it. Told you this guy was secretly a genius. The lizard decided to end its suffering and teamed up with the Slayer to land the killing blow. Look and watch, newbie. This is the Goblin Slayer you mocked the previous day. The man, the myth, the legend. Soon after, they made it back to the guild and celebrated their victory. The elf was a bit tipsy, while the priestess felt a bit depressed that she failed to lead them. The newbie kept on pouting like a brat. However, the lizard was too busy munching to even care about his feelings. The newbie confessed how his older sister was mutilated by goblins, and this reminded the priestess of her former comrade. Fate has a strange way of reuniting people, huh? The Goblin Slayer went out feeling depressed and hated himself for failing. The following day, the senior female adventurer was giving the rookie a lesson she'll never forget. The little one was already regretting her decision as boy magician watched on in horror. Another adventurer came by and told them to quit yapping and train their muscles, since this jockey was a brain-dead muscle freak. He continued to insult their reckless behavior and called them out for their failures. Ouch! That's quite the harsh pill to swallow. He then started chasing after them while Goblin Slayer was training other adventurers how to attack using a slingshot. Is he trying to give them the David training against the Goliath? Well, at least his training was a bit feasible, as opposed to the rest. The adorable receptionist came by to inspect Goblin Slayer's progress and couldn't help but flirt subtly. I always knew she had a crush on him, especially since her face lit up every time he stepped in. The cowgirl and the priestess came by with some food, and this meant the receptionist had to beat it before she received a beating. Everyone joined in to grab a bite, and the other jockey adventurers started chatting with the Slayer, asking him why he cared so much for the younglings. Since it was unlike him to do so, our boy tried to blow him off, but the man insisted on grabbing drinks later that night. Well, that was a first. Meanwhile, the boy magician and the cute rookies were talking trash about Goblin Slayer, considering him a worthless runt who cared about no one but himself and his quest. They even went to the lengths of calling him obsessive and strange. The gorgeous priestess came by with some food and had everyone munching on her delicious cuisine. Priestess couldn't shake the feeling that his sister could have led a prosperous life had it not been for the awful cave incident. The boy didn't know that they were party members, and the other rookies were all riled up to go back to practice after witnessing the priestess's progress. Later that night, Goblin Slayer bid the beautiful cowgirl adieu and left her alone in the farm with no company. He went to the bar and met up with two most powerful adventurers of the guild. Heavy swordsmen and spearmen. Yeah, they don't have names. The waitress brought over some drinks, and the spearman kept on teasing the swordsman about his posterior fetish. They toasted their victory and headed back speaking about beautiful ladies. Even so, Goblin Slayer wasn't interested since he was married to the pursuit of slaying and eliminating the pesky rodents. They tried to empathize with his cause, and the swordsman understood how men sought to rule over their domain and become kings. Quite the alpha male speech. Ha. Well, at least he had a personality, since I always considered him a Tood cutout character. The spearmen started riling them up and wanted them to confess their wildest dreams. Goblin Slayer took the opportunity to inform them that his dream was to become a hero. Not only that, but to fight dragons, rescue princesses, and save the world. Unfortunately, we all know what happened to his town and why he chose to follow this pursuit. The next day, the dwarf was training Boy Magician on the fundamentals of magic and told him to broaden his horizon from a single fire spell alone. The boy was limiting his reach and was told to follow the footsteps of the seductive witch. Despite her alluring beauty, she was an absolute monster house when it came to battle. The dwarf held her in high regards and told him to level up before facing more goblins. He continued drinking while the lizard and the priestess enjoyed a hearty meal with a rookie. The little one wasn't complaining since this training was much easier and delightful. The priestess then offered for her to join their team temporarily until she got a hang of things. The rookie tried declining her offer, since she was weak and would inevitably hold them back. However, they insisted and the priestess left the lizard alone with the food. Elsewhere, Goblin Slayer had Cowgirl feeling quite envious of his recent escapades. Going out without her, having fun while she sits alone waiting for him to return. It wasn't fair and she spoke her mind. Unfortunately, he wasn't the type to change for a woman and apologized in advance. I truly feel sorry for this beautiful busty maiden. Meanwhile, goblins started showing up and you know what that meant. Time for the Goblin Slayer to show everyone why he was the boss around here. Surprisingly, the rookies showed a brave face and the Slayer told them to wait here in case anything happened to him. However, when it came to goblin hunting, we all know how proficient he was. There was no way he'd die in battle. The priestess met up with him and witnessed the awful massacre. She tried sending her condolences and wishes to the deceased and met up with the spearman and the most beautiful character to ever grace our screen, the Witch of the Waverly Place. Fortunately, the rest of the cavalry showed up, along with the heavy swordsman who was feeling pumped up. They heard screams and decided to strategize before acting irrationally. The swordsman opted to go after the kids first, and the elf volunteered to rally the message. After all, she was the fastest runner amongst them. The lizard suggested that there was more than one hole given the enormous numbers of those scoundrels and the directions in which they were attacking from. The dwarf theorized that it was one tunnel leading to several holes. That way, they could launch a surprise attack. However, the witch pointed at the innocent civilians and insisted someone stay behind to protect them. The priestess was worried, so the swordsman volunteered to take care of the civilians, while Goblin Slayer and the rest went underground. The priestess then informed them to protect the rookie adventurers, since they're more likely to engage in a battle against the goblins assuming they were weak. Quite the shrewd analysis, wouldn't you say? Goblin Slayer was amazed by her deduction, and everyone motivated her to go help the younglings whilst they deal with the root of this predicament. Meanwhile, the young rookies were walking through the forest when goblins started attacking. They tried fending them off, but learned the bitter result of facing these heathens. The elf came back and complained, but was interrupted by murmurs of goblin activity. They came through the wall and were struck down by the dwarf and the rest. The spearman was with them while the witch decided to focus her efforts on the shaman. The elf retaliated and Goblin Slayer did what he did best. They got rid of the 1st Battalion and elsewhere. The swordsman met up with a hobgoblin. He told the younglings to look and learn how the pros do things. He ended up slicing it whilst the rookies were being chased in the forest. Goblins were too smart for them and the priestess came through with her holy light giving them a chance to strike. There was no end to these goblins, and the priestess suggested going to open ground since they were trapped here. The boy magician grew worried as he watched his comrades struggle to keep up. He mustered his strength and started thinking of Goblin Slayer and the dwarf. Using the motivation they gave him, he told everyone to cover their ears. Afterward, he unleashed a sonic blast, chasing the goblins away. The priestess then commanded everyone to escape, while they Can and boy magician felt proud of himself. He realized the magnitude of saving lives. While Goblin Slayer and the rest were dealing with the second wave, the lizard unleashed a sonic blast of his own, giving Goblin Slayer a chance to collapse the cave and flood it. The witch was impressed by his ingenuity, while the spearman grew tired of these pesky goblins. The next day, the priestess was rewarded for her hard work and was promoted to a higher rank. The receptionist congratulated her for acquiring the silver rank, and the elf celebrated her promotion. Finally, despite leveling up, the priestess was feeling depressed, since they didn't get rid of the goblins. Meanwhile, Boy Magician was talking with Goblin Slayer, telling him he was going to leave and explore the world. All these goblin expeditions got the best of him, and here he is now, chickening out when things got tough. Go figure! He wanted to be a dragon slayer, and another rookie adventurer decided to tag along. She was a total cutie, and these two would probably hit it off. Goblin Slayer bid them good luck and told them to take care of themselves. Cowgirl showed up and called him back to her farm, but our guy was too dense to understand her feelings. The following day, a messenger was running across town, aching to deliver a letter inside the guild. He gave one to the elf written on a leaf, inviting her to a wedding in their hometown. Her sister was about to get hitched, and the priestess couldn't contain her excitement. The dwarf was nonchalant about the matter, while the elf invited them all to join. Lizard Person wasn't too open on the idea, since he didn't want to intrude, and as expected, Goblin Slayer had a series of questions lined up for her. The dwarf was against the idea and protested while the priestess scolded Goblin Slayer for even thinking of refusing. She informed him that someone else will take care of the goblins in the meantime until he returned. But it was about time they all took a vacation and rest a bit. Lord knows they deserve it. The receptionist was surprised to hear the elf's sister was 8,000 years old, and she continued to explain the physical features common to all elves. Since Goblin Slayer was away, the receptionist had to assign the goblin missions to someone else. One of the other receptionists insisted they take her with them, since she was in need of a desperate vacation herself. Prior to heading out, Goblin Slayer had to get it out of his system and raided a goblin hideout looking to clean the riffraff before heading out. This looked like a church. However, it was forsaken by the heavens, since the angels didn't stand guard and protect it against the vile demons roaming the earth. The nuns were in bad shape and felt miserable, since their faith was shaken and put into question. The lizard tried discussing matters with the Slayer when the dwarf interrupted to show them an ancient text. The goblins were trying to steal. Cutie Elf showed up after inspecting the premises, and the priestess decided to cleanse the place and heal the crew. Her ability was growing, and this new one was known as Purify. Elsewhere, Cowgirl was working hard when her knight in shining armor came by feeling tired. She wanted to ease his concern, but Goblin Slayer jumped straight into it and announced the elf marriage he had to attend. He wanted her to tag along, and this caused the subject of marriage to come up. The following day, they got into a carriage and made their way across town. Why were the lizard and Goblin Slayer on foot, though? The place was buzzing with life, and the market was overflowing with abundance. Everyone was debilitated after the long journey, and Cowgirl wanted to go shopping with the cutie elf. Lizard and Dwarf offered their assistance and protection, and that left the priestess, who was dragged along forcibly. Goblin Slayer wanted to finish his quest and decided to visit the Archbishop. Oh wait, was it the beautiful Sword Maiden? Indeed it was, the lovely guardian of the country. Would you look at her beauty, as radiant and lovely as ever? Not sure who was more seductive, the Sword Maiden or the witch. Goblin Slayer showed her the artifact and wanted her to deduce it. She wasn't quite sure just yet and asked for some time to analyze it. He informed her of the upcoming wedding and wanted to leave, but she begged him to stay since his presence gave her comfort. Later that night, everyone celebrated the joyous occasion of a bountiful season, and soon after, the crew made their way through the rivers. It seemed quite risky, but the ladies were only concerned about their clothes. Lizard Person was stuffing his face while Goblin Slayer was preparing spears in preparation. He heard of goblin attacks on the river, and the ladies wanted to take a break from all the hunting. They passed through the first checkpoint and were officially out in the wild. From this point on, it was every man for himself. The scenery looked spectacular, and everyone was amazed to witness the beauty. Lizard Person suggested to look out from above, since that was the first place they'd attack from. Can't believe the lizard called it. Luckily, the priestess had her protection barrier ready to fend off the rocks and arrows. The elf started shooting them down one at a time, but it still wasn't sufficient since there was a horde of them. The Goblin Slayer prepared a spear launcher and threatened to end them in one go. The dwarf summoned a spirit to increase their speed, and the lizard suggested escaping instead of fighting. More rubble came their way, scaring off Cowgirl and the receptionist. They were blocked by a dam and couldn't progress, making them easy targets. The dwarf summoned another water spirit to push them through, and Goblin Slayer had a bad feeling about this. The priestess decided to use the Purify skill to cleanse the river and remove the dam in an instant. She gave them a clear opportunity to make a move, and the lizard used his sonic blast to give them another opening to escape. They were safely escorted, and the busty maidens changed into something more comfortable. Would you look at that? They were looking extremely gorgeous and had the lizard breathing heavily. The dwarf wasn't fazed by their hot looks, nor did Goblin Slayer, who was obviously blushing inside of the thick armor. The girls didn't hesitate to tease him and tried complimenting one another. The elf then took them fishing, hoping to snag some delicious dinner. Oh wow, the cowgirl and the receptionist were smoking hot, especially Cowgirl, who stole the show with her milky, creamy jugs. The priestess was a tad bit envious while Goblin Slayer was preparing their camp. Lizard Person was impressed by his dedication, but this wasn't surprising, since he was a man on a mission. The dwarf gave them a drink while they observed the hot ladies playing around in the water. They caught some fish and cooked them up real nice to complement their warm bonfire. This was quite the change in pace compared to the usual barbaric fights they had. The elf started bragging about her family lineage and how beautiful her sister was, who was in fact considered a high elf. Her brother was a total hole, but she warned them not to lose their patience with him. I can tell he was a jerk based on the way she talked about him. They were all having fun and laid loose for once. The Goblin Slayer, on the other hand, was still worried, since the goblins were close by. The following day, he was the first one up and kept guard while an elf showed up threatening him to identify himself. Goblin Slayer didn't give it much thought until the lizard and dwarf woke up and introduced themselves. The elf sheathed his sword and started questioning him about the arrows he retrieved, which belonged to their tribe. He assumed they captured one of their kind and rushed to the tent where he met the hot ladies looking fine as a cherry plum. Afterwards, he led them through the forest while the elf introduced him as her brother. Wait a minute, this guy was the jerk. No wonder, he'd give off cocky royal vibes. Let's call him High Elf, since no one in this show has proper names. The priestess couldn't shake the feeling that goblins were nearby, while the receptionist was confident they were safe, since Goblin Slayer was with them. The High Elf informed them there was more pressing concerns. A beast of legends who roamed the forest and destroyed everything in its wake. The elf couldn't believe it existed, since she only heard stories of it. Soon after, they made it to their home, and everyone was baffled by the ingenuity and beauty. So this is where the elf tribe stationed themselves. Neat. The Goblin Slayer insisted on looking out for more goblins while everyone was dying to grab a bite after their long journey. They started unpacking, and Goblin Slayer was chatting with the elf about a possible goblin champion that may attack their hometown. She didn't take the matter seriously, and that's when her older sister came to greet them. What should we call her? Elf sister, perhaps. She welcomed Goblin Slayer to their land, and it seems he was known throughout the land. Goblin Slayer met a fellow victim and informed her how he killed them. He killed them all. Sounds like a John Wick dialogue. The elf sisters started chatting about their life, and she insisted it was time to come back and rest. Perhaps get hitched to another elf and settle down. Unfortunately, this elf was addicted to the adrenaline and refused. Just then, the enormous monster showed up, causing tremors with every step. Was it a dinosaur? Goblin Slayer assumed it was an elephant until it got closer and saw its scales. The elf didn't know what to do since it threatened to destroy her home. The priestess suggesting distracting it and leading it back to the wild until they noticed a goblin on top of it. I've never heard a dinosaur being used as carriage. The high elf came by and asked them what they planned to do. Let me give you 3 seconds to guess what the Goblin Slayer responded with. The dinosaur was getting closer while the elf climbed up and shot it down in an instant. Well, that was quick. The lizard used his sonic blast, and the dwarf tried intoxicating it to slow down its pace. It was now time for the Slayer to blind its vision and used ropes to impede its progress. Now that it was stuck, the Goblin Slayer went to scout the area, and the High Elf commended him on his efforts. He really did save the day, and the priestess went ahead to heal the dinosaur. Later that night, the elf's sister showed her gratitude to them for saving her home and her marriage. Had it not been for the Goblin Slayer, the dinosaur would have literally bulldozered through the trees. Even so, she still wanted her younger sister to stop this adventuring life and return, since she considered it dangerous and reckless. Later on, they all celebrated their victory against the behemoth, and the dwarf didn't hesitate to get tipsy. Wherever there is booze, this man is surely willing to partake. The Goblin Slayer urged them to go after the goblin nest before they strike again and ruin the wedding. The crew agreed, since it's bound to happen again. Goblin Slayer informed him how they were smart and cunning, contrary to popular belief. If they weren't removed immediately, they'll find a way to pillage the land and take over. His words reverberated throughout the room as the High Elf changed the topic to the wedding, and how nervous he was about the entire situation. The Goblin Slayer told him it was a joyous occasion and did so in a monotonous tone. Does he ever laugh or smile? I guess we'll never know since he rarely takes off his armor. Elsewhere, the Sword Maiden deciphered the cryptic code and realized the message was of great importance. She asked for a pen and paper to write them a letter, since the world was soon to be destroyed if nothing changed. Meanwhile, Cowgirl caught Goblin Slayer leaving and told him to take care of himself. The receptionist was feeling ashamed since she was half naked. Afterward, the High Elf gave Goblin Slayer an elixir and told him to protect his sister no matter what. That should go without saying, since Goblin Slayer was a beast even monsters feared. Soon after, the goblins launched their attack and caught them lacking. Unfortunately for them, It was a trap, and Goblin Slayer managed to sneak up on them alongside the elf who shot them down. The boat was a decoy, and the lizard jumped off to aid the Goblin Slayer in combat. Not that he needed any assistance though, since this was his specialty. They reunited with the rest and headed deeper into the forest, where they ran into their hideout. You know what that meant, time to infiltrate and conquer. The dwarf was surprised by their weapons, and the elf used her lockpicking skills to get them in. The place seemed abandoned at first glance. However, we know how goblins admire creepy, damp places. As they walked into a room, they noticed how the goblins were polluting the river to poison the elves. The priestess started freaking out and gave the deceased a proper burial. Afterward, they made their way towards the goblins' hideout. The place was filled with all sort of traps and gave them a hard time navigating through. The priestess used her knowledge to decipher the code and unlock the door. The cutie elf ended up apologizing since she promised them a peaceful vacation, but ended up dragging them into her personal troubles. However, this was better than any vacation for the Goblin Slayer since it was his life purpose. She then put on her game face and told them to prepare for round 3. The lizard wanted to attack them from behind while Goblin Slayer attacked head on alongside the elf and priestess. Meanwhile, the Goblin Shaman was riling up his army, and the Goblin Slayer told them to take care of the leader first, since he was a formidable opponent. The lizard summoned his weapon, and they marched into battle. They went at it and showed no mercy, laying waste to these heathens and identifying the shaman. The elf tried shooting it down, but this was not going to be an easy task. The priestess decided to use her holy light to scare them off and gave the elf a clear opportunity. Unfortunately, it wasn't fatal, and the shaman released poisonous gas. The Goblin Slayer was on his knees, and everyone fell to the ground. The priestess panicked and didn't know what to do until she tried using her Purify spell, which cleansed the impurity of the shaman. He was finally down for the count, but the priestess felt horrible since she took a life using angelic magic. Goblin Slayer was back and gave everyone potions to recover. He was impressed by the priestess since she saved them life and allowed them to continue fighting. They made their way through the goblins and jumped over the edge. The dwarf used a levitation spell to ease their fall, and the shaman noticed a huge roar, followed with an intense flood, crushing them all. Now that all was said and done, it was about time to head back to the wedding. The priestess was the star of the show for this episode, a clutch warrior. Elsewhere, the heroes were busy fighting the demons in the Nether and remembered the words the Sword Maiden told them about the destruction of the world. It was time to step up and save Earth once again.
My luck is good or bad. Doesn't matter if it was the elf.
Back at the elf wedding, everyone was gathered to witness the splendid union of these two intertwined souls. They shot an arrow into the sky and vowed to serve one another for the rest of their lives. Everyone celebrated the communion and enjoyed themselves to the fullest, as they should, since they thwarted the goblin invasion. Would you look at that, cowgirl? And the receptionist looked gorgeous and had all eyes on them. In a flashback, we saw the Sword Maiden in action fending off the demonic horde. She was not a force to be reckoned with, and her team managed to take on the Demon Lord's army all on their own. The Sword Maiden held up a barrier while the rest used their magic to extinguish the monsters. Afterward, they searched inside the labyrinth for treasure, and we were flashed back to the present, where Goblin Slayer and his crew were busy fending off a sea dragon. The priestess distracted it, giving the lizard an opportunity to strike it down. It seems a couple of fish monsters begged them for help against the sea dragons. The team reluctantly accepted the mission and were stuck in the middle of the ocean, trying their best to live and fight another day. These were no ordinary sea serpents. Reminds me a lot of One Piece and its legendary monsters. Goblin Slayer and his crew returned to the guild, where the receptionist received a mouthful from the Slayer, who was disappointed. The reward wasn't all that generous either. Chump change compared to the hardships they had to go through, especially when you split it 5 ways. Regardless, the team was a bit proud of themselves since they managed to eliminate something dangerous for a change. Afterward, Goblin Slayer brought the cowgirl a seashell and gave her the chills. The next day, he went back to the guild and met the Sword Maiden, who was in disguise. She didn't want anyone to know that she was there and had an extremely urgent matter to discuss with Goblin Slayer. She showed him a map of where the goblins had been spotted and was terrified to even speak of their atrocities. Her trauma started to resurface, and to make matters worse, She had a meeting somewhere close to their nest and was shaking in her boots, just imagining the situation. The Goblin Slayer told her not to fret, since hunting goblins was his specialty after all. He promised to kill them all, no matter how many they were. Soon after, he gathered his crew, who were promised heaps of gold if they protected the Sword Maiden through her journey. The Goblin Slayer bid his loved one farewell, triggering the envy of the maiden. He led the way on foot as they escorted the beautiful busty mommy. She genuinely needs more screen time. Even if it was just her chilling and chatting, I'd still watch the whole thing. She got closer to Goblin Slayer and tried shooting her shot, but our guy was as dense as ever and didn't even allow her to finish her statement. The priestess got up and was confused to see the two right next to one another, and that's when they sensed goblins. Goblin Slayer locked her in the carriage and asked her to wait as she knelt and prayed. They heard wolves approaching, and it was goblins riding them. There was an entire army of them, and this was going to be a tough battle, especially since they were out in the open. The elf and lizard held their own while the priestess felt confused. The elf looked on as the priestess used her shield to buy them some time. The lizard ambushed them from behind, and they got rid of all of them by daybreak. The master tactician at work. They wondered if there were more, but safely arrived to the appointed destination. There was a long line in front of them, and the crew wondered what was going on. As they approached the gates, the guards gave them a hard time until they saw the archbishop and started cowering and kowtowing her presence. She must be a famous figure in this part of town, huh? Elsewhere, the princess was throwing a hissy fit since the king denied her request to become an adventurer. She wanted to take a walk and asked the maid to leave when her father, His Majesty, returned. Meanwhile, Goblin Slayer and his gang escorted the Sword Maiden into town where flocks of none welcomed them. The maiden offered them to stay at the temple and protect her from a close distance. They split up into groups, and it was no surprise the dwarf ended up in a bar getting high on beer. A true drunkard through and through. The Goblin Slayer was a bit worried since the army that attacked them had a leader who was hiding in the shadows. Dwarf and Lizard told him not to worry since they were safe within the city walls, especially since this was the royal capital where the king abided. Their words triggered an emotional reaction in him, and the scene shifted to the priestess, sending her condolences at a graveyard. I'm guessing it was the sister of Boy Magician. The elf tried easing her concern and told her to have some fun while she was young. She dragged her to the bathhouse where hordes of naked ladies enjoyed themselves. Now this was my favorite scene in the entire show. Would you look at that? Just a couple of hotties enjoying themselves. You know what would make this scene better if the Sword Maiden or the witch came by? Soon after, the princess, who was identical to the priestess, dropped by and started asking her several questions. If I didn't know better, I would have considered them as doppelgangers. The elf came back and couldn't find their belonging. I'm guessing it was the princess, and this caused the princess to break down into tears. How unfortunate. The Sword Maiden came by and got super close to Goblin Slayer. It was obvious to anyone with eyes, except for the dense fool, that is. The following day, a meeting was held between the royals to discuss the impending doom. Everyone advised the king to remain cautious and prepare. They all gave their 2 cents and didn't seem to agree on anything. As soon as the Sword Maiden spoke, everyone listened. Just then, they were informed that the princess escaped and was attacked and kidnapped by goblins. You know what time it is? It's goblin slaying time. The heroes were anxious to head for the princess, but the king insisted they take care of other matters since the Goblin Slayer was already tasked with saving the princess. Can't believe he placed his faith in them. Goblin Slayer must be a legend in this parts. The crew was escorted by a royal while she begged them to save the princess. The Sword Maiden rushed to thank Goblin Slayer for volunteering to save His Majesty's prized possession and told them to save her at all costs, since the reputation of the kingdom was on the line. She took something outside of her bosoms and considered it a lucky charm. As they went out, the Sword Maiden confessed how she was afraid and couldn't fathom the possibility of another goblin invasion. She hated them to the core, it seems. Soon after, they found the carriage where the goblins attacked and tried to deduce where they could have taken her. The crew made it to a frozen cave and tried to come up with a shrewd plan to eliminate them without harming the princess or anyone else. The lizard suggesting launching a surprise ambush and tried to sneak in from the roof. He helped them up, and they found a way in. This time around, the lizard took charge and started attacking the goblins like they stole the last piece of pizza. They were soon surrounded, and everyone had their hands full. The Goblin Slayer lit them ablaze and made a run for it. He then used a scroll to devour the goblins, and told them it served as a teleportation device. Well, that was a neat trick. They were in the dark and couldn't light any fire. The priestess felt useless in the meantime, since she was told to hold off until they met the leader. Meanwhile, the heroes were battling against grotesque-looking demons and looked to enjoy the thrill of the hunt. They did not hesitate and gave it their all against what seemed like a mutated monster. Back in the cave, the Goblin Slayer assumed there was a Goblin Shaman leading them, and the lizard led the way since he was familiar with the structure. They had to hurry up before the princess was done for. They decided to go all out as soon as they saw the goblins and priestess empowered them using her magic. The Goblin Shaman was prepared for a ritual and used a barrier to protect themselves. However, the lizard rushed in for the kill while the elf knocked them down from a distance. The Goblin Slayer, you ask, well, he was slaying the demons. The priestess was up next and used the Purify spell to thwart their ritual. Soon after, the Slayer crushed the shaman and saved the princess, who was in a dire state to say the least. But at this point, she must have been traumatized beyond belief. The lizard suggested destroying the altar, while the Goblin Slayer insisted on slaying all the goblins. Just then, the shaman transformed into a demonic hand and unlocked a snowstorm. This guy turned into Prime Aokiji and used a frosty spell to turn the cave into a blizzard. The dwarf used some ice to shelter them, but it wasn't going to last long, since the demonic hand was extremely powerful. They were out of ideas and energy, and the arms started moving towards them. The situation was dire, and the Goblin Slayer tried distracting it using a slippery slope. Unfortunately, he was struck down, and the priestess didn't know what to do next. The elf tried shooting it down while the priestess managed to lock it underneath and use her shield to block its path. However, this demonic hand was too powerful for her until an elevator ascended, crushing it in one go. Not sure if they planned that out or if it was dumb luck. However, there were more goblins to deal with, and escape was starting to seem difficult at this point. Not impossible, just difficult. They slowly made their way to the exit and found an entire army of goblins waiting for them. Oh snap, this was a nightmare to say the least. What were they going to do now? They were severely outnumbered and had no choice but to fight. Hold up, was that the Sword Maiden? Talk about heavenly justice. Would you look at that? This actually gave me goosebumps, I won't lie. A scene straight out of a fairy tale manual. Soon after, they made it back to the guild and explained the situation to the receptionist, who was worried sick about the Goblin Slayer. They were certainly saved by the Sword Maiden, who came in a pinch. The priestess shed tears upon remembering what they went through, while the Goblin Slayer was still focused and locked in. His only purpose in life, to slay goblins and nothing else. That's who he is. You best remember his name.